Mirage is one of the best Warframes in 2025, deleting enemies so fast that the game cannot even keep up with the spawns sometimes. I recently already featured her in my best weapons platforms video, but as you'll soon see, what I showed there doesn't even come close to her true power potential. So, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna take an in-depth look at Mirage, how she works, why she is so incredibly strong, and I even have two completely different builds prepared for you. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, follow me on Twitch, link in the video description, and with all that being said, let's jump right into it. You know the drill. First things first, let's talk about Mirage's abilities, starting out with her passive, which is a very simple thing. I'm just gonna put it on screen right here. It's basically mobility. You can like it, you can dislike it, but it's not really something we need to delve deeper into. Let's rather start out with her first ability, which goes by the name Hall of Mirrors, and it is an absolute powerhouse. At first glance, what it does is relatively simple. You create 4 mirror images of Mirage that will be all around you and follow your every step. These mirror images distract the enemies, are completely invincible, and they also attack in sync with you. Now, one thing to note here is that not all 4 mirror images will actually shoot when you shoot, but only the 2 of them that are in that moment in the front position, and also unfortunately, they do have diminished damage output as well as crit and status chance. Another funny thing here is that even though only 2 of them will shoot in sync with you, if you're using a melee weapon, then all 4 of them will attack in sync with you, which is specifically funny if you're running some type of ranged melee weapon. Just one note here with the glaives, if you throw them, then yes, all 4 mirror images will throw their glaives too, however only you can detonate them mid-air, the other ones just don't. Let's rather now speak about the augment mod for Hall of Mirrors, which is very interesting, but after closer inspection, I wouldn't recommend it in every single case. What this one does is, it increases the damage output of your mirror images by 5% per enemy kill, which can ramp up to a maximum of plus 50%. This damage bonus is much stronger than it looks because it is a final multiplicative damage bonus. However, it really comes down to which weapon you're running on Mirage to determine whether it is worth the mod slot or actually not. Here's what I mean. While the mirror images will shoot in sync with you, they're not actually aiming at the same point that you're aiming at, meaning you will always have the 4-ish meter offset that the clones are away from you. In other words, if you're just using a normal standard hit scan weapon, then your mirror images are probably going to miss a lot of their shots, massively diminishing their actual damage output to the point where I would argue it might not even be worth sacrificing a mod slot for an augment mod that makes them stronger if most of their damage ends up going straight into the wall anyway. My personal recommendation here would be go for an AoE weapon, like for example the Exceltra, that can deal damage to enemies even if you don't hit the exact shot, and then buffing up the damage output with the augment becomes a whole lot more viable. Ability number 2 goes by the name Sleight of Hand, and I'm gonna be honest, I do not want to spend all too much time on this skill because none of the 2 builds that I'm about to show today will actually utilize this skill at all, and in my opinion, this one is by far the weakest ability in Mirage's kit because it got power crept quite a bit over the last couple of years. Now, if you want to know all the ins and outs on what this skill does, and believe me, it is quite a lot, then also here, I would recommend you take a quick look at the wiki article yourself. However, the main way that players tend to use this one is to turn pickups that are on the map into proximity mines dealing damage to nearby enemies. This, for a long time, has been one of the most meta builds for nuking maps in the Sanctuary Onslaught, and don't get me wrong, this definitely still works with a dedicated build, of which you will find many on YouTube, but the damage output of this skill completely pales in comparison to the massive power steamroll that is the rest of Mirage's kit, which is why I do not really want to focus on it in this guide right here. However, skill number 3 is the total opposite because this is Mirage's bread and butter, going by the name Eclipse. We all know it, we all love it, and it is an insanely powerful ability. Here's what it does. Eclipse has a tap and a hold version. By default, if you tap it, you turn into a sort of shadow form where you will have up to 90% damage reduction, making you incredibly tanky. If you hold the ability, you will turn into the light version of Mirage, which gives you an incredible damage buff to your weapon, which is counted as a completely separate multiplier, meaning it is multiplicative to everything else, making this one already very strong from the get-go, but it also scales with ability strength, meaning it is no problem at all to simply 7x your entire weapon damage output with this. Now, one thing to note here is that the damage buff from Eclipse by default only affects yourself. In case you want to extend this damage buff also outwards to your mirror images, then you gotta use the augment Total Eclipse, which makes it accessible not only to you, but to all allies in range, including your mirror images. So for the maximum weapon damage output, I totally recommend always going with this one here. Now, if you think that Eclipse is already an absolute powerhouse of a Warframe ability, then let's start talking about her 4, because this one also hits like a truck. Mirage's 4 is called Prism, and that is basically what it does. You throw a prism which shoots out lasers that lock onto enemies nearby and start to damage them over time. The damage per tick that those lasers deal to the enemies ramps up over time, meaning with a lot of ability duration, you can get some crazy damage scaling out of this, even into pretty high levels. However, this does come at a cost, because not only do you have to pay energy to cast the skill, but it will also continuously drain your energy as long as it is on field. Prism also has a nice interaction with Mirage's 3rd ability, Eclipse, because what this does is, if you use the Shadow Eclipse, the one that makes you more tanky, then this reduces the energy drain per second on your Prism. But the much cooler thing here is, if you use the damage buffing Light version, then this will increase the damage ramp up per second of your Prism, meaning it scales even faster and gets to even crazier damage numbers much faster. Now, while Prism is definitely very strong, the absolute force of nature here is the augment for this skill called Prism Guard. What this one does is extremely simple. It massively reduces the skill duration, but it will make it that the Prism, instead of being static, will follow you around. This is not only incredibly broken strong, but also the reason why I said in the intro that sometimes the game simply can't keep up with the enemy spawns because you're just clearing the entire room much too quickly. Don't worry, we're gonna talk about that build in more detail here in just a minute. First though, if you could drop the video a like, that would be super nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. Alright, now that we know how Mirage works, let's look into the builds where I have 2 prepared for you today. One is focused on the run and gun playstyle that buffs the absolute heck out of your weapons, and the second one is focused on room clearing with your ultimate that deals absolutely ludicrous amounts of damage. Let's though start out with the Gunrunner build first. At base, this one is very simple to play. All you really need for this is your first skill for the doppelgangers, as well as your 3rd skill Eclipse for the massive damage buff. Just jump into the mission, activate both of them, and go to town. If you wanted to, you could always use a helmet ability. The choice here is really yours. This build doesn't have any specific requirements, and that's basically already it when it comes to how to actually play the thing. As for the build itself, let's start out with my helmet option, where I went for Evade from Side 09, exactly like I did in my recent video, because in my opinion, this one solves Mirage's biggest problem, which is survivability, and turns Mirage into an absolute menace. As for the Archon shards, what I did here is also pretty simple. I went for 3 blues to increase my maximum energy so I don't have to use a flow mod, and then 2 red ones for more ability strength so the damage buff gets even higher. However, these 2 red ones are definitely not mandatory, and if you want to use something else here, then you're absolutely welcome to do so. Now let's next take a look at the build itself, where I want to start out with the Aura mod, this one being Growing Power, increasing our ability strength whenever we deal a status effect with a weapon, so this is probably going to be on all the time. Up next, in order to make sure that our mirror images deal as much damage as humanly possible, we want to absolutely go to town in terms of ability strength, so I went for Power Drift in the Aura, Mold Augmented, Arcane Crepuscular, which gives us ability strength every time that we're invisible, and with Side 9's Helmet ability, we are constantly going to be invisible, so that is also a source of ability strength, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, and Umbral Intensify. Just by the way, one quick note here. Theoretically, you could also go for Archon Intensify instead of Umbral Intensify, because with Side 9's invisibility skill, you do get heal. However, due to the fact that you are going to be invisible, you're not going to be targeted all that much, therefore it's going to be difficult to keep Archon Intensify up because you're just not going to take regular damage that you could heal back up in order to trigger it. Next, I wanted to make sure that our buffs last a bit longer, therefore I went for Duration with Narrow-Minded as well as Prime Continuity, Equilibrium for the energy economy, Total Eclipse to extend our massive Eclipse damage bonus to our mirror images, and then finally, I personally went for Hall of Malevolence, the augment for your first ability, because I like to play Mirage with AoE weapons. However, just like we said in the abilities section, if you play a setup where your mirror images are probably gonna miss most of their shots, I would recommend to take this one out and rather use something else instead. This right here then would be the full Gunrunner build, and as you also see in the background, the enemies absolutely do not stand the slightest chance against the absolute steamroll that this build turns our Mirage into. If you like running and gunning in Warframe, then I would definitely recommend that you give Mirage and this build a try. Alright, so much for the quote-unquote cookie-cutter Gunrunner build, nothing out of the ordinary here, but now let's take a look at the, in my opinion, much more interesting build, and that would be the Prism one that deletes entire rooms in a split second. Now, before we start talking about the build itself, I first want to tell you which helmet ability I use, because this one has a strong influence on how we're gonna mod her later on. As a helmet ability, I went for Grendel's Nourish. On the one hand, this build is quite costly to play on the energy, so having Nourish help us out with our energy economy is an absolute godsend. However, also the viral damage infusion for our weapons is going to play a role, but we're going to get into that as we talk about the weapon option that we're going to play on this build. Let's first though take a quick look at how to play it in practice, and this is also relatively simple. First off, you turn on your mirror images, then use Grendel's Nourish for the buff, as well as Eclipse. However, here you can decide whether you want to use it in the light or the dark mode. The light mode will increase the damage ramp up of your ultimate, which is nice. However, the damage output is going to be so immense that at base level Steel Path, I would argue you don't even need that, and you could rather go for the Shadow version, which makes you a little bit more tanky, massively helps with survivability, so you can definitely play around a bit with the light and the dark mode. And then once you've set up all the buffs, you're going to try to keep your Prism up pretty much all the time and just enjoy all the carnage that it produces. But let's now though take a look at the build itself, starting out again with the Archon shards, which unfortunately are completely different than with the Gunrunner build, which is also the reason why I unfortunately don't have them installed on my Mirage herself at the moment, but still, let me tell you what I would personally recommend running here. First of all, the casting animation of Prism is incredibly long, which is why I would recommend going for 3 yellow Archon shards all into casting speed. If you have, feel free to also use 3 Tau Forge ones. Believe me, you're gonna feel a massive difference. For the other 2 slots, I would recommend either going for 2 reds into ability duration, or going for 1 red into ability duration and 1 Tau Forged green one that allows you to stack up to 13 corrosive procs on any given enemy to reduce their armor almost to 0 simply by going for corrosive alone. Don't worry, you're gonna see why corrosive in just a minute as we talk about our weapon option. Let's first though take a look at the build, where in the aura I went for corrosive protection to reduce the enemy armor, of course Prism guard so the Prism follows us around in the level, and then the rest of the build massively doubles down into both duration as well as strength. For the duration, I went for narrow-minded as well as prime continuity. However, given the fact that this time we're actually going for the AoE damage through the Prism, we do need to compensate for the massive loss in ability range from narrow-minded, which is why I went for stretch, ending us up at 79% range. It's not a lot, but it is enough for Prism, and you're not going to feel like your range is going to be too low. Just one quick note here with Stretch, you could instead also go for Archon Stretch. However, I would only recommend doing so if you have the spare mod capacity anyway, because even though Archon Stretch can give you energy per second, remember, we want to have the Prism on all the time, and the Prism drains your energy per second, which negates any energy gain per second effects completely, meaning if you use Archon Stretch on this build, you're not really going to benefit from it most of the time. And now that we're already speaking about energy economy, of course, we also here go for Equilibrium to get more energy income, and the rest of the build focuses mostly on increasing our ability strength so that we deal more damage. For the strength, we go for Blind Rage and Precision Intensify, which massively boosts the damage of our fourth ability, that just so happens to be the Prism. And then also in both Arcane slots, I went for even more ability strength, with Mold Augmented as well as Arcane Ice Storm, that not only gives us ability strength, but also even more ability duration, helping us to keep the Prism on even longer. This right here is the full build that I am currently running on my Mirage. However, I should note here that due to the fact that I have two completely different builds on this Mirage, it is unfortunately not possible to fit the absolutely optimized version of this second build on the same Mirage. So what I would recommend in an ideal case is replace Power Drift with Prime Sure-Footed. Why? You're going to see in a minute when we're talking about the weapon, as well as the fact that I use Natural Talent here for more casting speed because I don't have the yellow Archon shards for the casting speed. If you have the yellow Archon shards for the casting speed though, then you can replace Natural Talent with whatever you personally like. You could go for Augur Reach to maximize the range, or something to further enhance your ability duration. I think these would be my two preferences here. Now, with this build, we are already gonna deal a ton of damage even to Steel Path enemies. However, it has one big problem, and that is, especially in Steel Path, enemies have a lot of armor and get a lot of damage reduction because of it. And Mirage, unfortunately, does not have an armor stripping ability. So, how we're gonna solve this? With our weapon of choice here, which would be the Epitaph or the Epitaph Prime. The Epitaph deals a lot of status effects in a big AoE, and given the fact that we're gonna have the mirror images, it's not only us that fires this thing, but we're actually gonna fire 3 times as many projectiles, also dealing 3 times as many status effects, which is incredible priming potential. Now, what we want to do on the Epitaph is mod for Corrosive to reduce the enemy's armor, as well as Heat, which further reduces enemy armor. And the great side effect, and also the reason why I personally want to go for the Epitaph here, is that it force procs Cold, which makes it very easy to fully freeze the enemies, therefore constantly triggering our Arcane Ice Storm, which gives us more ability duration and more ability strength. This right here is the Epitaph Prime build that I personally use, helps me reduce the enemy armor basically down to 0, inflicts massive viral effects which further increases my damage output because we have Nourish and that infuses viral on top of all of this, and as I said, it also freezes the enemies at the same time. Finally, for our companion, you're kind of free to use whatever you like. It's not like you definitely have to go for one option. However, I went for Diriga with this build right here, just in a general support role, and due to our coil as well as synth deconstruct, this also helps with our energy income because we get more drops out of the enemies. And if you now want more great gun buffing options, then don't miss my recent Gun Runner Warframe video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demonoid Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Lycan Shepherd, Anakanio 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Yagis, Hoke Hunter, Noob Phoenix, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.